At a time when Europe's future hangs in the balance, its two most senior Christian leaders, the head of the Catholic Church, Pope Francis, and the head of the Church of England, Archbishop Justin Welby, have abandoned their most sacred duty to protect and defend the values of the Bible. The world is locked in a civilizational battle of values, threatened by terrorism and violent jihad. Now is the time for religious leaders to come to the defense of society, to speak up for Western values and freedoms. Instead, Pope Francis and the Anglican Archbishop are silent, indifferent to the murder of Christians in Africa and to the threat of terrorism throughout Europe, and outright hostile to Israel's attempts to battle these jihadi forces led by Iran. As the latest example, Archbishop Welby has come out strongly in support of the recent International Court of Justice ruling against Israel, which puts him in direct opposition to the Bible. The International Court of Justice, the ICJ, in an advisory ruling, declared Israel to be an illegal occupier of Palestinian land in East Jerusalem and the West Bank. Archbishop Welby gave his full backing to the ruling. This was his statement. The International Court of Justice has made clear that Israel's presence in the occupied Palestinian territories is unlawful and needs to end rapidly. It is clear that ending the occupation is a legal and moral necessity. The Archbishop puts great trust in the ICJ and the system of international law. This trust is misplaced. The ICJ is an arm of the United Nations, an institution dominated by despotic regimes. Of the 193 members of the UN General Assembly, only 84 are ranked as free societies by Freedom House, a think tank in the US. The UN is thus dominated by regimes who don't subscribe to the key tenets of liberal democracy and who are antithetical to the foundation values of the Church. Though the ICJ maintains a veneer of objective legal procedure, in effect it is nothing more than a political body to advance the UN's anti-Western and anti-Israel agenda. The ICJ doesn't even try to appear unbiased anymore. The presiding judge is from Lebanon, a country currently at war with Israel. Furthermore, there are compelling legal arguments that the ICJ judgment is badly flawed. According to international law, the West Bank is, contrary to the ICJ's ruling, disputed rather than occupied territory. Indeed, there has never existed a Palestinian state on this land or part thereof. The West Bank was under Jordanian control before the 1967 war. But there's a much more serious issue at stake, and I address it as one religious leader to another. How can the head of the Church of England support an ICJ ruling that deems the West Bank and East Jerusalem occupied territory to which the Jewish state has no rightful claim? In doing so, Archbishop Welby is effectively rejecting the Bible. The Bible is not just a book of theology, it is a book of historical facts. What today the UN and its ICJ calls the West Bank, the Bible calls Yehuda v'Shomron, Judea and Samaria, and lies squarely within the borders of the land that God promised and delivered to the Jewish people, which raises this question: does Archbishop Welby actually believe in the Bible? Are Jews, in his view, illegal occupiers in the land of Israel, the same land of Israel that includes the West Bank, that is mentioned at least 170 times in the Hebrew Bible as the land that God gave to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as an eternal oath, an unconditional covenant? Does the Archbishop believe in the book of Genesis, in which God said to Abraham, I give this land to your descendants? Does he accept the book of Deuteronomy, in which God lays out the borders of the land of Israel, from the desert to the Lebanon, from the Euphrates River to the Western Sea? What about the book of Joshua, in which under God's instructions the Jewish people enter the promised land, which is then divided among the 12 tribes? The book of Judges details the Jewish people's existence in the land of Israel and all the trials and tribulations they endured. The book of Samuel describes King David establishing Jerusalem more than 3,300 years ago as the capital of the Jewish state. The book of Kings relates how King Solomon built the ancient Jewish temple on Jerusalem's Temple Mount almost 2,000 years before the Al-Aqsa Mosque was built on its ruins. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah document how after the Babylonian exile, the Jewish people returned to Israel and built the second temple in Jerusalem on the same spot. How can anyone who believes in the Bible say that Israel is, as the ICJ says it is, an illegal occupier of the Temple Mount? Does the Archbishop regard these accounts of the Bible as mere myths? How can he agree with the ICJ that Israel is an illegal occupier of Jerusalem? Jerusalem, the same Jerusalem that appears more than 660 times in the Hebrew Bible and about which King David wrote in the book of Psalms, "If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget its cunning." If he reads his Bible, the Archbishop should know Jerusalem existed before London and was the capital of Israel before anyone had heard of Britain. Does the Archbishop believe, even his own Christian Bible, that Jesus was born in Bethlehem as a Jew in the land of Israel? Today, Bethlehem lies in the area demarcated by the ICJ as under illegal Israeli occupation. Is he saying that Jesus was born on Palestinian land in a Palestinian state? Or was he born a Jew in Israel? Look, political realities may demand that at some point in the future, Israel give up some of its ancestral land to achieve an accommodation with its neighbors. But it is another thing to say that Israel is an illegal occupier of the land where Jews have been indigenous inhabitants for thousands of years. And the head of the Church of England denying the claims of the Bible in order to support the ICJ is not only a threat to Israel, but to the United Kingdom and Europe as we know it. The jihadi ideology that seeks to destroy Israel is a clear and present danger to the future of Europe and its value system. Europe's bedrock values of freedom and democracy emerged from Christianity, with its roots in Judaism and the Hebrew Bible. Personal liberty flowed from the foundational ideas of belief in God and the sovereignty of the individual created in God's image as described in the book of Genesis. These values are under attack. With open border policies in the UK and across Europe, immigrants have poured into these countries, many brandishing a violent jihadi ideology deeply hostile to Christianity, to liberal democracy and Western values. Immigration, when managed with respect for the values of the host society, has great potential to enrich Western countries. But when immigrants seek to isolate themselves and overthrow the values of the society they enter, as is happening in Europe today, this poses a dire threat. Entire communities follow a jihadi philosophy, creating no-go areas, ungovernable in cities like Paris and London, with anti-Semitism surging to the point where Jews feel unsafe in Europe today. Jewish children in London, for example, can no longer wear school uniforms with Jewish emblems in public for fear of being attacked. This tells us that something terrible is wrong. And Europe's foremost religious leaders, Archbishop Welby and Pope Francis, do nothing, say nothing, except to echo the narrative of the same jihadi forces in their barbaric battle against Israel. They also stand passively as their fellow Christians are butchered in Africa by jihadi groups with direct ties to Israel's enemies in Gaza and the West Bank. Groups like Boko Haram, ISIS, and Al-Shabaab that are the ideological brothers in arms of Hamas. Both Archbishop Welby and Pope Francis have largely ignored the crisis or refused to call it by its name. When the horrific kidnappings of Nigerian schoolchildren occurred earlier in March this year, nowhere in Archbishop Welby's or Pope Francis' statements of concern did they mention that the perpetrators were jihadists seeking to wipe out Christianity in Africa. They cannot even name the murderous philosophy that drives these killings and abductions. Their cowardice and lack of moral clarity threatens the future of the free world and stands in stark contrast to Pope John Paul II, who took on the might of the Soviet Union. This was in 1979, at the height of the Cold War, with communism spreading across the globe and Soviet Russia setting up puppet regimes throughout Eastern Europe. Religion was banned, free speech was banned, individual rights and freedoms of any kind were banned. Against this backdrop, Pope John Paul II announced a visit to Poland, which, as it borders Russia, was a particularly critical part of the Soviet Empire. Polish authorities had no choice but to accept the visit from the first Polish Pope. This was like going into the lion's den. It took much courage, and in a country where religion was outlawed, Pope John Paul held an open-air mass for 300,000 people with millions more watching on TV. In a stirring address, he railed against the Soviet attempt to exclude religion from the public and political life of nations, and against the atheist and tyrannical principles of Soviet communism. Emphasizing spiritual freedom as a form of resistance, the Pope told the crowd, "No human ideology or system can overpower you, no matter how strong it may appear. The power of truth transcends all political systems." The entire crowd broke out into a chant, "We want God," a spontaneous outburst of long repressed spiritual longing, an emotional outpouring of their wish to be free from the chains of communism, and a powerful repudiation of the atheistic Soviet regime. On his second visit to Poland in 1983, Pope John Paul explicitly encouraged resistance to totalitarian control in a direct rebuke of the Soviet regime for controlling information and suppressing dissent. He said, "Truth cannot be suppressed. Human dignity and the right to know the truth belong to every human being. There can be no justice without freedom, and freedom cannot exist without truth." He gave the people hope. He sparked the solidarity movement, the Polish rebellion against Soviet control, which eventually brought democracy to Poland. And when Poland became free, it had a knock-on effect in other communist countries and marked the beginning of the end of the Soviet Empire. This is true religious leadership. Pope John Paul understood that this was not just a political issue, but a moral one. The Soviet Union denied its subjects not just religious freedom, but all individual human rights. It denied the sovereignty of the individual created in God's image. Pope John Paul stood up for the values of the Bible, and when they came under assault, he acted decisively. For more than a decade, he worked with President Ronald Reagan and Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher to bring down the Soviet Union. In the end, together, they succeeded and liberated Europe and the free world from tyranny and oppression, none of which would have been possible without the Pope's unwavering moral leadership. The timid response of both Pope Francis and Archbishop Welby to the threat of violent jihad stands in stark contrast. This current war, like the Cold War, is a civilizational battle of values between the violence and intimidation of the ideology of jihad that seeks the destruction of anyone they deem as the infidel, and the foundation principles of the free world that hold sacred the sovereignty of every human being created in God's image. Without moral clarity and brave religious leadership, Europe and the cause of freedom will fall. Archbishop Welby's support for the latest ICJ judgment in defiance of the Bible reveals where he stands on these issues, and that bodes ill. If Israel is abandoned to jihadi forces, Europe is next. I conclude with a message to Archbishop Welby and Pope Francis. The book of Deuteronomy says, "I place before you life and death, blessing and curse. Uvacharta b'chaim." Now choose life. I urge you, choose life. Choose the forces of life championed and protected by Western society. Do not cower before those who glorify violence and death, who spread fear and intimidation. Fulfill your basic fiduciary duty. Speak up for and defend Christianity and Christians in Europe and Africa. Stand with Israel in its brave fight for survival against the brutal jihadists of Hamas and Hezbollah led by Iran. Defend and protect the noble societies of the free world who recognize the equality and dignity of every human being created in God's image as He taught us in the book of Genesis. Go back to the Bible and don't underestimate your power. Asked if he was worried about a Catholic backlash against his repressive policies, Stalin was unmoved. He said, "The Pope, how many divisions does he command?" Pope John Paul II had no army backing him up. He commanded no divisions, and yet he, with the power of ideas and values, of faith and vision, inspired the hearts and minds and souls of the oppressed peoples of Eastern Europe, and with them brought down the evil empire of the Soviet Union. And now history beckons you, Archbishop Welby and Pope Francis, to save Europe. Act before it's too late. If not now, when?